Thank you. It's a tremendous privilege to be here. I have lived more than half my life outside of Europe, partly in Asia and partly in North America, but I am a passionate European. And for the moment, I'm only in the United States because I had a very clear call. And I would love to get the green light to come home. I want to talk on a topic where I think Europe is potentially positioned to be the pioneer for the world in giving an answer. And Christians have to take the pioneering job in Europe. One of the world's greatest questions today is how do we live with deep differences, especially when those differences are religious or ideological. The last century was the most murderous century in history. And as people point out, it wasn't just war with 100 million dead. It wasn't just politics with repression of another 100 million killed, but ethnic and sectarian violence. And clearly, the opening years of the 21st century show how that's continuing. Many people would say that the American experiment provides the answer. Their own framers called it the true remedy for this issue. But anyone who knows America knows the deep culture warring going on today. And Europe, while it's floundering at the moment on this issue, actually, I think, has the potential to lead the world in showing how we live with deep differences in a world that's global. Let me set out to you 6 steps in thinking it through. I'm sure some of you will disagree strongly with me. Sadly, we have no time for discussion. But I think we should be in the forefront of pressing these issues in the public square. Step number 1. Know why freedom of conscience is crucial for everybody. Religious liberty is scorned today. It's considered liberty for the religious. At best, a second-class right to freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. But our reformers well understood, and the pioneers of religious liberty well understood, that religious liberty and freedom of conscience is the first of the political rights. Logically, freedom of assembly assumes and requires freedom of speech. You don't want to get together with people that are hugging. But freedom of speech assumes and requires freedom of conscience. You want to speak on those issues of which you're convinced because you're bound by the dictates of conscience. It is the first of the political rights. Secondly, it is the key to a civil society. Much is spoken of a civil society today and the health of societies if between the average citizen at the bottom and the government at the top, there is a thick layering of organizations in which people can volunteer and participate and donate and so on. And in such an exploding entrepreneurial world, the freedom of people to pursue what are their visions is fundamental. And freedom of conscience actually underlies a civil society. But freedom of conscience is also critical to social harmony, because it is the truth that allows us to bring together strong political convictions with strong political civility. You can see many countries have one or the other, but very few have both. I often speak in China. And the Chinese will inevitably tell me that Hu Jintao talks about a harmonious society. He does, often. I say that's no big deal. All they have is strong diversity and strong harmony, but no liberty. And it's actually a respect for freedom of conscience which allows you to have diversity with liberty and yet social harmony. And we need to make these arguments strongly in the public square, why freedom of conscience is crucial for everybody. Secondly, we need to appreciate why and how freedom of conscience is threatened today. let me point to three broad movements, all undermining freedom of conscience. The first is the marriage of separationism, a legal notion, with an aggressive secularism, a philosophy, which is slowly excluding religious exercise and religious expressions in many of our countries. We all know the individual cases. Secondly, freedom of conscience is threatened by a vision of Islamic activism which wants to benefit Islam and privilege over other faiths. And I'm particularly referring to notions of defamation or blasphemy. And what you see, if you follow it carefully, is a very radical orientation of freedom of conscience. Freedom of conscience used to protect the right of believers, not beliefs. It's now being shifted to protect the right of believers, and in particular, one set of believers, namely Muslim believers. That is a radical disembowelment of freedom of conscience, which we should resist on principle in the name of everyone. Thirdly, we have a radical assault from the overreach of certain homosexual activists. For their own tactics, they've declared that homosexual rights are a civil right. And in the name of that civil right, all other rights can be seen as an obstruction or an obstacle, including freedom of conscience rights. Now, anyone who looks at that carefully can see that what they're doing is not just establishing their right at the expense of others, they're actually undermining all rights altogether. Because if a right now considered fashionable is able to trump other rights once considered fashionable, but now considered highly alienable, clearly all rights are a matter of power only. And the whole human rights program is a sham. I partly welcome that overreach because some of the thoughtful liberals are now seeing the gay activists are arguing for something that cuts off the very branch on which they're sitting. Thirdly, we need to recognize the weaknesses in Christian responses so far. First, many Christians argue the law alone rather than what Alexis de Tocqueville called the habits of the heart. It is a secular fallacy to think that rights and freedom are established only by law. Tocqueville pointed out rightly that freedom is best established when the habits of the heart, the traditional moral standards and customs and so on, respect those rights and freedoms. That is the real guarantee. And you can see since the 1920s, secular liberals have put all the weight on law and litigiousness. And sadly, as many of the defense funds in the United States and now increasingly in Europe show, Christians are relying on law alone, which is absolute folly. We're playing their game, and it's a game that will not work. The second Christian mistake in responses is to argue in defense of our interests and not the common good. One Jewish journalist said to me in the 1980s in America, evangelicals sound like as if they talk of justice, but really they're concerned with just us. And you can see in many areas, if we sort out the common good, and religious liberty and freedom of conscience are always best respected when the rights of the smallest minority and the least popular community are respected. And if all rights are respected, our rights too will be respected. And we need to be careful how we're arguing. The third mistake, and maybe this is more common in North America than in Europe, has been the extraordinary reliance on academic studies. I'm not a Marxist, but here is where Karl Marx is right. Philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. In America, we have academic studies on the problems of religious liberty and freedom of conscience coming out of our ears. But they haven't done a single thing to affect the public square, which is where the issues are fought. And I've seen, certainly in Britain, people talking in the same way. One more study, one more analysis of this. The real challenge is to produce a vision of the public square which could be established, which could guarantee these things. The fourth point. We need to assess the different options for the public square. The simple fact is that many of the Western settlements of religion in public life, which go back many centuries, are under pressure today because of things like immigration, and they are not working. And so the challenge is, which will be the vision of a settlement for the future? One option is what's called the vision of a sacred public square, where one religion is given a privileged position and everyone else is second rate. Now that, of course, is the condition of the established churches still, including my own country, and that is the position, say, that many people feared in the United States with the rise of the Christian right, that would come about. You can see in the modern conditions of Europe that a deep part of the European secularity is a profound reaction against the corruptions of the state churches of the past. And you can see, sadly, in America today, much of the turning against the Christian faith among the younger generation is precisely because of the excesses and the lack of wisdom of the Christian right. And we need to learn the profound lessons of the hangover of the reactions against establishments in the conditions of modern diversity. The second broad option is what's called a naked public square, where all religions are strictly excluded, although, of course, as we know, secularism thereby gets smuggled through the back door. But as you look, you can see on the one hand that that is highly illiberal, because most people still have religious assumptions and religious affiliations, and if their voices are excluded from the public square, it is an exclusion of free speech. On the other hand, in many countries that also undercuts the legitimation of the country, and that's certainly true of the European Union too. The third option, and I'm saying all this exceedingly briefly, the third option is what's called a civil public square, which is a vision of public life where everyone of all faiths, based on freedom of conscience, are free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their faith and their worldview, but, here's the but, within a broadly agreed framework of the rights and responsibilities of each citizen towards all other citizens. In other words, a right for a Christian is a right for a Jew, is a right for an atheist, is a right for a Mormon, is a right for a Muslim, and so on and so on and so on. We've got to assess which of those, as Sandra was saying, fulfills best our Christian understanding, in this case of justice and freedom and community, and then argue for that publicly. Which leads to my fifth point, and only one after that. We need to clear up the misunderstandings of civility in public life and of a civil public square. Civility is not niceness. It's often easily dismissed as if it's tea party etiquette or dinner manners or whatever. As if we all loved each other long enough, everything would be well. Nonsense. Civility is a classical virtue and a duty whereby citizens can negotiate their differences with other citizens whose rights they profoundly respect. It is a classical virtue, extraordinarily important in our diverse communities today. The second misunderstanding of civility is that civility is a matter of interfaith dialogue. Almost always when we're talking about religious tensions, people go towards interfaith dialogue. whether we're talking about the Muslim call to a common word or a Karen Armstrong type vision or whatever. No. As evangelicals, we agree with the philosophers who point out that the differences between faiths are irreducible and ultimate. And there never, ever will be a common unity, however loving we are, however long we talk. The differences are irreducible and ultimate. The commonality is at the level of a political framework of the rights, the so-called 3 R's, the rights, responsibilities, and respect with which people of each faith are able to negotiate and engage people of other faiths. And of course, it's that vision which allows people to be truly faithful to their own faith, including us evangelicals, and yet know how we engage people of other faiths. The third misunderstanding of civility is that civility will lead to a false tolerance. If we respect people's right to believe, we accept all that they say, and we'll have an indifference to moral differences, and we'll just be tolerant in a very sloppy sense. No, this is the way I put a better position. The right to believe anything does not mean that anything anyone believes is right. The right to believe anything is freedom of conscience. And if you think hell, the doctrine of hell means that God respects our rights. In Roger Williams' terms, he doesn't rape our conscience to make us bow to him. The right to believe anything is absolute. But that in no way means that we accept everything that anyone believes as right. But it means when we think they're muddle-headed, or morally confused, or maybe have a position that's profoundly socially evil, we engage with them, respecting their right to believe what they believe, but exercising our responsibility to disagree persuasively and hopefully civilly. The last point we need to think through. We need to face up to the requirements for an effective resolution of this issue. The establishment of human rights is still controversial in many parts of the world. But if you look at the success of human rights, and of course here again, as with the European Union, many of the architects were people of faith in Christ, like Charles Malik. But you can see where human rights has been successful, it is only so when there's a 3-step movement, none of which by itself will affect things. First, there has to be a declaration of principles. And I personally would like to see Europe, or Christians in Europe, pressing for a declaration of freedom of conscience for all citizens. But that is only the beacon. The second step, and with human rights it came in many times 15, 20, 25 years later, is the legal implementation of the framework which protects that beacon of rights. But the third step is actually the crucial one too, and that is civic education. It used to be clearly understood that in free societies, everybody is born free, but not everyone's worthy of freedom. And to make people equal to the duties and virtues of freedom, they needed to be educated for liberty. Liberal education, civic education, or what Alexis de Tocqueville called the habits of the heart. I personally think some part of the world, a while back the Americans thought they would be there. But the bitterness and the polarization and the gridlock in America today is very, very profound. And in many ways they are destroying their own best heritage. So at the moment I don't see America taking the lead on these things. Europe, as I said, I view as floundering. With all the challenges of immigration and so on, each country tended to fall back on the default position of its historical past. The French, their strict laïcité. The British and the Dutch, for example, tolerant, espousing quickly state multiculturalism. And you can see how disastrous it's been. But if Europe truly is to look to the future and raise the question how Europe lives with its deep differences, maximizing religious liberty, freedom of conscience, freedom itself, for all the European citizens, we will have to re-examine these default positions, which are the legacy of the past, because they're inadequate, and really ask ourselves what vision of the European future can lead us forward. And I believe it will be such a vision of a civil public square, and that we Christians should be in the forefront of arguing for it, not just for ourselves, and not just for all other citizens in the common good in Europe, but if one part of the world were to establish this well, eventually it could be a beacon to the entire world.